Morning my son called after 4 years of nothing. I was sitting on the back porch in Knoxville, drinking bad coffee and watching a cardinal fight with its own reflection in the sliding door. I didn't recognize the number at first. Tennessee area code, but not one I knew. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. And I'm glad I did, depending on how you look at what came after. Dad. That's all he said. Just Dad. Like the 4 years hadn't happened. Like the last conversation we'd had hadn't ended with him telling me I was a bitter old man who didn't deserve his mother's loyalty. Like he hadn't hung up and taken my daughter-in-law and my only grandchild with him into silence. I said, "Hello, son." There was a pause. I could hear something in the background, a TV maybe, or a radio. Then he said, "I saw the photos on Aunt Cecilia's Facebook." I waited. "The lake house," he said, "in Montana. I'd bought it 6 months prior, a modest place, nothing extravagant, but it sat on the edge of Flathead Lake, and the sunsets came down over the Mission Range like something out of a painting. I'd posted nothing myself. I don't use social media, but my sister had visited in August and apparently shared a few pictures. I hadn't thought anything of it. Nice place, my son said. It suits me. Another pause. Listen, Dad, I've been thinking. It's been a long time. Too long. Honestly. And, well, Renwick and I were talking, and we thought maybe it was time to, reconnect. Renwick is my daughter-in-law's name. I had spent 11 years trying to like her and failing quietly, the way you do when you love your child and accept what comes attached. She had a talent for entering a room and making it smaller. That sounds fine, I said. We were thinking Thanksgiving. We could come to you, or, well, actually, Dad, we were thinking maybe you could come here. To Columbus. And, he cleared his throat. We've actually been going through a rough patch financially. The restaurant Renwick opened, it's been hard, and we have some things we'd like to discuss. As a family. There it was, not hidden, not even dressed up particularly well. After 4 years of silence, my son called to reconnect and managed to mention financial trouble and a desire to discuss things within 90 seconds. I said, "I'll think about it, son." I sat on that porch for a long time after we hung up. The cardinal had given up on his reflection and flown off somewhere. The coffee had gone cold. I was 63 years old, retired from 31 years in civil engineering, widowed 4 years prior, which is, not coincidentally, the same time my son went quiet, and I was sitting alone on a porch in Knoxville wondering what exactly my life had added up to. My wife, Greta. That was her name, Greta. And I still can't say it without feeling the shape of it. Died in the spring of the year my son stopped speaking to me. Pancreatic cancer, which does not give you much time to prepare. She was diagnosed in February and gone by June. Those 4 months were the worst of my life, and also, strangely, among the most clarifying. You learn a lot about people when someone they love is dying. What I learned about my son was that he had opinions about her state. Greta had money of her own. She'd inherited from her parents, invested well, managed it carefully over decades. She also had opinions about what happened to it. We'd discussed it many times. She wanted a portion to go to a small literacy nonprofit she'd volunteered with for years, a portion to remain in trust for our grandson, and the remainder to me, with the understanding that I'd handle things as I saw fit. My son had different ideas. He came to Knoxville 2 weeks before she died, which I respected. He sat with her, held her hand, cried. Whatever else I've felt about him since, I believe that grief was real. But on his second evening there, after she'd gone to sleep and we were sitting in the kitchen with bourbon neither of us were really drinking, he told me that he thought the nonprofit idea was a mistake. She's worked hard for that money, he said. It should stay in the family. It's her money, I said. Her decision. She's not. He stopped. Started again. She may not be thinking clearly. I put down my glass. I looked at my son across that kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework as a boy, where we'd eaten 10,000 dinners, where his mother had laughed until she cried at bad jokes and card games, and I said very quietly, "Don't finish that sentence." He didn't, but the thought had been spoken. and you can't unspeak a thing. He left 3 days later. Greta died 9 days after that. At the service, he shook my hand like I was a business acquaintance, and he and Renwick drove back to Columbus the same afternoon. I didn't hear from him again for 4 years. I won't pretend those years were easy. The first one, especially, was a kind of gray nothing. I went through the motions, cleaned out Greta's closet, handled the estate, moved to a smaller place. I thought about calling my son approximately once a week and talked myself out of it approximately once a week. I'd done nothing wrong. I wouldn't apologize for nothing. Pride, maybe? But also something more than that. I'd watched him look at his dying mother and calculate. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger is too hot for what I felt. It was more like grief on top of grief, like finding out the house you built had a crack in the foundation you'd never noticed. The second year, I found the porch in Knoxville. The third year, I found the lake house in Montana. I started fishing again, something I hadn't done since my own father was alive. I cooked more. I read. I had coffee with my sister on Thursday mornings, and we talked about nothing important, which was exactly what I needed. I realized, okay. That surprised me. So when my son called that October morning, I was not a desperate man. I was not lonely in the way I think he expected. I was not sitting by the phone hoping someone would remember I existed. I was watching a cardinal. I called my attorney the next morning. Walter had handled my affairs for over a decade, estate planning, property transactions, all of it. And he was the kind of man who had heard everything twice and reacted to nothing. I told him about the call. He listened without interrupting. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to know where I stand," I said, "before Thanksgiving, before whatever conversation they want to have." "That's easy enough," he said. "Come in Thursday." I drove downtown Thursday morning. Walter's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled permanently of old carpet and coffee, which I found reassuring. A man whose office smells like that is billing you for work, not atmosphere. He'd pulled everything together. The lake house deed, the Knoxville property, the investment accounts, the remainder of Greta's trust, the pension, everything. We went through it methodically. I'm an engineer by training, so spreadsheets don't frighten me. What did give me pause was the total. I'd been living quietly for 4 years. I hadn't looked at the whole picture in a while. I was, it turned out, considerably more comfortable than I'd consciously registered. Walter tapped a line on the document. "The lake property alone has appreciated 40% since you purchased it. In the index funds." He shook his head slightly, which for Walter was the equivalent to a standing ovation. "You've been lucky with timing." "Greta was careful," I said. "This is mostly her." He nodded. "Either way, if your son is coming with the intention of discussing finances, he's going to see what you're working with." "I know. What do you want him to see?" I thought about that. About the last conversation in that kitchen. About his hand on mine at Greta's funeral. Efficient and dry. About 4 years of no birthday calls, no check-ins, no acknowledgement that I'd lost a wife, and might need something as simple as a phone call. "I want to be honest," I said. "I just want to be ready." I called my son that evening and told him I'd come to Columbus for Thanksgiving. He sounded genuinely pleased. Maybe that was real. I allowed for the possibility. Columbus in November is the color of an old penny. Brown grass, gray sky, bare trees. I drove because I prefer driving to airports, always have. 14 hours from Knoxville, which sounds like a lot, but there's a patience you develop when you spend enough time alone. You stop fighting the hours. I arrived the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. My son and daughter-in-law lived in a suburb called Worthington, in a house that was large in the way. Houses are large when financed entirely on expectation. The mortgage on a place like that, I estimated, was between $3,000 and $4,000 a month. I didn't ask. My grandson, Philip, he was 7 now, and I hadn't seen him since he was 3, came running out the front door before I'd even parked. He'd apparently been watching the window. That hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. He had Greta's coloring, that particular shade of auburn, and he ran like she used to walk, like the ground was slightly inclined in his favor. I crouched down, and he crashed into me like a small, warm cannonball, and I held on longer than was probably dignified for a man my age. Renwick stood in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold. She was wearing an expression I couldn't read. Not unfriendly, exactly, but calculating in the way she'd always been calculating. Measuring. My son stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, and he looked older, which I supposed was fair. "Dad," he said, "it's good to see you." "You too," I said. I meant it. That first evening was almost easy. Philip demanded I see his room, his Lego collection, the fish tank, the particular patch of backyard where he'd found something he called a fossil, but was almost certainly a chunk of concrete. We ate takeout because no one had cooked, and my son opened a good bottle of wine, and we talked about nothing that mattered, which was appropriate for a first night. Wednesday was quieter. Philip went to school. Renwick went somewhere errands, she said. My son worked from home, so we were in the same house, but moving around each other carefully like furniture you weren't sure belonged where it was placed. Around 2 in the afternoon, he knocked on the guest room door and said, "You want to take a walk?" We walked through the neighborhood for about 40 minutes. He talked about the restaurant Renwick had opened, a farm-to-table concept in the Short North neighborhood, opened 18 months ago. Currently losing money in the particular way restaurants lose money, when the concept is good but the margins aren't and the rent is punishing. He talked about it carefully, selecting words with visible effort, and I listened. "It's been hard," he said. "We're into it for a lot. And the projections we had, they weren't wrong exactly, but they were optimistic." "Restaurants are hard," I said. "Yeah," he kicked at a dry leaf. "We've been thinking about a bridge loan. Something to get through the first few years until it starts to turn. But the banks, with the current rates and with the existing debt load, it's not—" He shook his head. "It's not looking great." I waited. "I know we haven't talked in a long time," he said. "And I know I haven't been. I know I should have called. I should have. I'm sorry for that." "Okay," I said. "I want to repair things. I genuinely do. With you." He paused. "And I was hoping, maybe, if you were in a position, you might be willing to consider helping with the restaurant as an investor." There it was, properly dressed this time. I asked him how much he had in mind. He said 300,000. He said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, and then immediately began qualifying. It could be a loan, structured with interest, whatever was comfortable, and he had projections he could share, real ones, not the optimistic version. I nodded while he talked. We finished the loop of the neighborhood and came back to the house. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. That night I called Walter from the guest room with the door closed. 300,000, he said when I told him. To start, I expect. What's the restaurant's debt situation currently? He didn't say, but reading between the lines, substantial. Walter was quiet for a moment. You know what I'm going to say. Tell me anyway. A loan to a family member in a failing business has a recovery rate so low it's practically theoretical. And if the relationship is already fragile— I know, I said. This doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means you should decide what you're doing with full information. I thanked him and lay on the guest room bed looking at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, my grandson was asleep. Down the hall from that, my son and his wife were either asleep or talking, and I could guess what they were talking about. Thanksgiving itself was good. I mean that without irony. The food was real and plentiful. My son cooked a turkey that he'd clearly been anxious about, and which turned out well. And Philip sat beside me at the table and told me extensively about a book he was reading, about deep-sea fish. I learned more about the anglerfish that afternoon than I'd known in my previous 6 decades combined. It was one of the better conversations I can remember. After the meal, after Philip had been settled in front of a movie, my son and daughter-in-law sat across from me at the cleared table. So, Renwick said, she'd let my son do the talking on the walk. But this was her moment, and she knew it. We wanted to revisit what you two discussed Wednesday. I said, all right. We want to be transparent, she said. The restaurant is behind where we projected. We knew it would take time to turn profitable, but we underestimated some startup costs. The kitchen equipment alone. She shook her head. We need capital, and we're not in a position to get it conventionally. Your son loves you, she said, and we want you to be part of this, part of the family. We thought maybe you'd want to invest in something, something real, something you could point to. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. I've thought about it, I said. I've thought about it since Tuesday, and I want to be honest with you both, because I think that's the only thing I know how to be at this point in my life. I pulled an envelope from my shirt pocket. I'd had Walter prepare a one-page summary, printed and folded. I put it on the table between us. That's my current financial picture, I said. I want you to see it before I say what I'm going to say, because I want you to know I'm not telling you I can't help. I'm telling you why I've decided not to. Renwick reached for the envelope before my son did. Old habit, I supposed. She unfolded it. I watched her face. Numbers settled over her expression like weather. The lake house alone, I said, has appreciated significantly. The investment accounts are healthy. I'm comfortable, more than I perhaps realized. I want you to know that I know you know that. My son looked up. 4 years ago, I said, I sat in a kitchen with you while your mother was dying in the next room, and you told me her decision about her own money might be the result of cognitive decline. I kept my voice level. I'd practiced this. Not the words exactly, but the level. I've thought about that night many times. I've thought about whether I was too harsh in how I received it, whether grief makes people say things they don't mean. I've been as charitable as I know how to be. The room was quiet. I've also spent 4 years not receiving a single phone call, not on my birthday, not at Christmas, not when I sold the house your mother died in, which was a harder day than I expected. Not once. My son opened his mouth. Let me finish, please. I folded my hands on the table. You called when you saw the lake house. That is the sequence of events, and now we're having this conversation. I'm not angry about it. I want you to understand that I'm not sitting here angry. I'm sitting here with a clear picture of what happened and when. Renwick put the paper down. I'm not going to invest in the restaurant, I said. Not because I don't have the money, not because I don't want things to go well for you, but because I've learned something in the past 4 years, which is that money doesn't repair the thing that's broken. It just gives both people something else to argue about later. My son said, Dad, I'd like to have a relationship with my grandson, I said. I'd like to have a relationship with you. I'd like that a great deal, but I'd like it to be a real one, which means it starts with honesty and it doesn't start with $300,000. Renwick stood up. She said something sharp and short that I won't repeat here, and she walked out of the room. We heard the bedroom door close. My son sat across from me for a long moment. I do want to repair things, he said. That part was true. I believe you, I said. Both things can be true at once. He rubbed his face with both hands. He looked exhausted, in the particular way of someone carrying more than they've admitted to. The restaurant might fail, he said. I think it might fail. Then let it fail, I said. That's survivable. People survive that. And the money. Dad, we have real financial pressure. I know. And I'm sorry for that. But I'm not the solution. He didn't respond to that. We sat there for a while. The television murmured down the hall. Philip's movie. Something animated and bright. I'm going to drive home tomorrow, I said. But I want to give you something before I go. I reached into my jacket pocket. I'd brought 2 things to that table, and I put a second envelope down. Smaller. That's a letter, I said. I wrote it on the drive up. 14 hours is a long time to think. I pushed it toward him. It's not a lecture. I'm not asking you to respond. It's just things I wanted you to know. About your mother. About those 4 years. About what I'd like, going forward, if you're willing. He looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up. And separately, I said, I've arranged something with Walter. Not for you. Not for the restaurant. But there's a college fund, set up in Philip's name, fully funded. It'll be there when he needs it, regardless of anything else. That's not contingent on anything. That's not leverage. It's just, he's my grandson. My son was quiet for a long moment. Why are you being this decent about it? He asked. His voice had gone strange. Because I'm 63 years old, I said. And I've buried a wife, and I've watched a friendship I thought was a father-son relationship disappear for 4 years, and I don't have the energy for anything but decent. I drove out of Columbus the next morning, Friday, before anyone else was up. I left a note on the kitchen counter for Philip about the anglerfish, a small drawing I did at the table with a marker I found in a kitchen drawer. I'm not much of an artist. It looked more like a balloon with teeth. I thought he might appreciate it anyway. 3 weeks later, my son called. Not about money, not about the restaurant. He called on a Sunday morning, and he said that Philip had drawn his own version of the anglerfish and wanted to send it to me. And did I still have the same address? I said, I moved. Let me give you the new one. And I gave him the address of the lake house in Montana, where the sunsets still come down over the Mission Range like someone is trying to show off, and the fishing has been better than I deserve. And the coffee is no longer bad because I finally bought a proper machine. He said, That sounds nice, Dad. I said, It is. You and Philip should come see it sometime. He said, Yeah, I think we should. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him.